This is Pastor Curry, pastor of the Ezion Fair Baptist Church, Wilmington's most exciting church, the church that love ya and anything you can do about it. Today with Coffee with Curry, we continue our celebration and our acknowledgement of Hispanic Heritage Month. It is very interesting that from September the 15th through October the 15th, right in the middle of both months, they have this acknowledgement here in America. And I want to make sure that we continue to celebrate, highlight all the greatness and the excellence that is found within our Latino community. And brothers and sisters, it's going to be a great show. We dug deep. We decided to go and get some of the different things that to be able to share of the goodness of the Latino community. So I hope you will call somebody real quickly, tell them Coffee with Curry is on, and let's get after it. And we're back. Well, today, as I shared, we're going to take some time to just really take a walk through our Latino community's heritage. There is a fundamental difference in the two Spanish-speaking communities, one called Hispanic, the other is called Latinx. And what we want to do first is basically share with you the difference between the two.
In the past few years, the word Latinx has become more popular, but there's a lot of strong opinions about this word.
Too many cultures have used the masculine to refer to all people. That's messed up, which is why the right word is Latinx.
Look, you can't just make up a word and force people to use it.
I'm a proud Latinx. What the hell is a Latinx? Is it a Cuban Kleenex? If so, then it is the best Kleenex.
Maybe you've heard this debate among friends and family, or seen it talked about all over social media. Words like this, meant to represent a huge, diverse population of people, always have a big job to do. And there are many words that people use to define themselves, based on ethnic background or cultural heritage.
So, for example, I might call myself Chicana at certain points and then call myself Latina and then use Latinx, right? We create preferences and we still understand each other.
This is Christina Mora. She's a professor of sociology at UC Berkeley, and her research is focused on how categories like Latino, Hispanic, and Latinx emerged in places like the United States. So where did the term Latinx come from? And should we use it to describe such a large group of people?
When I was born, on my birth certificate, there was only two options to describe what I was. I was either Afro-American or Caucasian. Now, clearly I wasn't Afro-American, so I was white by default.
In the 1960s, if you just looked at Census Bureau reports, you'd probably not know that there was a pretty significant and sizable and growing Latinx community.
That's because back then, there weren't a lot of categories on the census. It was like the government didn't see these communities. This was a problem for organizers across the country. Communities in the Southwest that were Mexican American were pushing for issues like bilingual job training and equal access to education, much like Puerto Rican and Cuban communities on the East Coast. But politicians like Lyndon Johnson said these were regional issues, not the job of an administration focused on national constituencies. These communities were seen as existing in their own bubbles, despite having to fight similar battles against discrimination and for more rights and resources. So organizers decided to unite to create a national identity. But finding a name that would communicate a shared cultural identity and help in this fight for recognition in the United States was not easy. One of the first terms proposed was brown, because the census already thought in terms of black and white, quite literally. But other ethnic and racial groups, like Southeast Asian and Filipino communities, might use this term too. Latin American was another idea, but for many, this sounded too foreign.
An important part of this struggle was to sort of argue that Latinos belonged here, that Latinos were part and parcel of U.S. history. And so many feared that Latin American would refer to an outsider, a permanent sort of foreign status, and not inherently American.
The term La Raza, meaning the people or the race, was in wide use. But conservative Latinos worried it would be seen as too radical and too specific to political movements in Mexico. So in the end, the Nixon administration settled on an imperfect solution, Hispanic, meaning someone having an historic or cultural link to Spain. But then, in the 1990s, the connection to Spain was being re-examined. After all, many of these communities didn't really think of themselves as European or Spanish.
as sort of Latino was being sort of much more used in vogue, that we are connected to each other by our history of being colonized versus our connection to Spain, which is what Hispanic tends to sort of conjure up in politics and in history.
However, Latino and Latina are different from something like African American or Italian American. They're not gender neutral. So today, a new word has emerged.
Latinx comes with a new generation that is thinking about gender politics in ways that question whether we should have a binary, in ways that see this as being in solidarity with transgender or with non-binary populations.
So everyone who doesn't identify as male feels included. Come on, you can say it.
You know, the X was important. The X was meant to be noticed, to make you pause, to really think about intersectional politics and intersectional identities.
Is it even proper Spanish or English? I bet you can't even tell me a word that ends in NX.
Jinx, links, minx.
However, Spanish speakers might still find that the X doesn't work for them. It's not an easy letter to say in Spanish. Spanish usually uses an A for female or O for male at the end of words, but some Spanish speakers are starting to use an E at the ends of words to make them more gender neutral. So a term like Latine escapes the binary of Latino or Latina.
On the one hand, some argue it's just a way of being able to say a non-binary form in Spanish, but others have argued that it is a way of creating these transnational solidarity movements with much more progressive gender politics in Latin America that tend to use Latine and not Latinx.
Okay, so this is a lot of words and terms. Whether you're part of the community or not, people may ask, what's the correct word to use? And the reality is, there isn't just one word. Gallup recently asked Hispanic adults what they prefer, and 57% said it really doesn't matter.
You know, I think it is nuts to think that they would always and forever hold true to just one category that would last the test of time. I think this is just a reflection of the dynamism that continues to happen and the ways that groups come to see themselves as their sort of social political environment evolves.
While there might be a different experience within each region, having a unified national identity makes everyone more visible.
There is something called, for example, a Latino COVID death crisis. It is actually happening.
Latinx people are more likely to be essential workers on the front lines. Members from the community died at a much younger age from COVID-19.
It is happening in Mexican American communities, it's happening in Central American communities now. That's incredibly important to acknowledge, and that we acknowledge only when we can see data patterns that disaggregate these communities from whites.
These communities can point to clear data and ask for things like better job protections and better access to health services. So while it's very important to have a conversation about what words to use, we need to be acting in more meaningful ways too. The point is that this is connected to a much larger conversation about culture, about creating a shared sense of belonging, and being visible as a community.
You know, there is no one size fits all.
Me llamo Valeria Sánchez y soy mexicana.
Dominican American.
Cuban American.
Brasilera Americana.
Mexican American.
So I am blended right down the middle.
Latinx is resilient.
We are passionate,
spicy, colorful,
making lemonade from the lemons.
¿Cómo se dice? Eclectic.
It really is the quilt for everybody.
We definitely share a warmth and love for life.
To me, Latinx is community. It's a beautiful array of cultures.
The smells, textures.
No matter what we're doing, there's gonna be food.
From the music, the dancing,
language, customs.
Being Latina, I realized that I was kind of navigating two worlds, two languages, two cultures, but I wouldn't have it any other way.
I'm the first generation to be raised in California.
I was born in Mexico City and moved to the United States when I was 8 years old.
I felt like I was growing up in the Dominican Republic as a first-generation American. We couldn't speak English in the house.
My parents actually taught me Spanish as my first language.
That means that you are a great translator by the time you are 4 years old.
Living between two languages is always tough. So when you blend those two worlds together, I think it's the most beautiful representation of what Latinx means. Latinx is all-encompassing.
What my mom would always tell me and my siblings as a kid is we were 100% Mexican and 100% Black. And we didn't have to choose. And we never have to choose.
Growing up queer and brown wasn't the easiest thing, but my grandfather first accepted me and I owe so much to him.
Having my family as a support system was key to my success. I remember them telling me, échale ganas, mija. which sort of translates into give it your all.
Everything I do is to honor the sacrifices that they made and to make them proud.
I would always find a way to present versions of their stories for the world.
And what's great about it is there isn't just one story.
We continue to be the largest minority in the United States.
We come in every shape, size, ethnicity.
There are so many different experiences and identities that are not really captured.
And people who are so excited to share their similarities and celebrate their uniqueness.
I think the future is very promising for Latinos.
We're only growing closer as a community.
No matter where we're from,
We are all united. One familia.
We are proud.
Somos orgullosos.
We are honoring our history.
Y haciendo historia.
Ni de aquí,
Y ni de allá.
Somos
Somos
Latinx.
We are Latin.
We are Latinos.
We are American.
And we're back. I hope you had an opportunity to really see the difference and the fundamental difference in the two communities, the Latinx as well as the Hispanic. Now I want you to take a look at the historical aspect of it, the history of the Spanish-speaking community. And within this history, you're going to find that African Americans are very much tied to this community.
Mexico is the 11th most populous country in the world, with 121 million people. Mexico is among the world's 15 largest economies and is the second largest economy in Latin America. Welcome to our animated show of history. This episode presents a brief history of Mexico. The earliest human artifacts in Mexico are chips of stone tools found near campfire remains in the Valley of Mexico 10,000 years ago. Mexico is the site of the domestication of maize, tomato, and beans, which produced an agricultural surplus. This enabled the transition from Paleo-Indian hunter-gatherers to sedentary agricultural villages beginning around 5000 BC. In the formative era, villages became more dense in terms of population and developing into chiefdoms. The earliest complex civilization in Mexico was the Olmec culture, which flourished on the Gulf Coast from around 1500 BC. Olmec cultural traits diffused through Mexico into their formative era cultures in Chiapas, Oaxaca, and the Valley of Mexico. In the subsequent pre-classical period, the Maya and Zapotec civilizations developed complex centers at Calakmul and Monte Alban, respectively. During this period, the first true Mesoamerican writing systems were developed in the Epi-Olmec and the Zapotec cultures. In central Mexico, the height of the classic period saw the ascendancy of Teotihuacan, which formed a military and commercial empire whose political influence stretched south into the Maya area as well as north. After the collapse of Teotihuacan in 600 AD, competition ensued between several important political centers in central Mexico, such as Xochicalco and Cholula. During the early post-classic period, central Mexico was dominated by the Toltec culture, Oaxaca by the Mixtec, and the lowland Maya area had important centers at Chichen Itza and Mayapan. The Aztecs, the last of pre-Columbian Mexico's great native civilizations, rose to prominence in the Central Valley of Mexico around 1427 by partnering with the Toltecs and Mayans. This triple alliance conquered smaller cultures to the east and west until the Aztec Empire spanned Mexico from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf Coast. The Spanish first learned of Mexico during the Juan de Grijalva expedition of 1518. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire began in February 1519 when Hernán Cortés arrived at the port of Veracruz. After taking control of that city, he moved on to the Aztec capital. In his search for gold and other riches, Cortés decided to invade and conquer the Aztec Empire. The territory became part of the Spanish Empire under the name of New Spain in 1535. Much of the identity, traditions, and architecture of Mexico developed during the 286-year colonial period. Cortés then colonized the area and named it Nueva España, New Spain. By 1574, Spain controlled a large portion of the Aztec Empire and had enslaved most of the indigenous population. Worse, the diseases brought into the society by the Spaniards devastated the indigenous population of Nueva España, killing an estimated 24 million people between 1521 and 1605. As a result of its trade links with Asia, the rest of the Americas, Africa, and Europe, and the profound effect of New World silver, Central Mexico was one of the first regions to be incorporated into a globalized economy. Being at the crossroads of trade, people, and cultures, Mexico City has been called the First World City. The Catholic Church's influence was felt in the region when missionaries began arriving in 1523. The missionaries built many monasteries and converted millions of people to Catholicism. Concerned about the Catholic Church's ever-growing power, King Carlos III of Spain expelled the Jesuits from Nueva España in the late 1700s. Inspired by the American and French revolutions, Mexican insurgents saw an opportunity in 1808 as the king abdicated in Madrid in Spain and was overwhelmed by war and occupation. The rebellion began as an idealistic peasants' and miners' movement led by a local priest, Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, who issued the Cry of Dolores on the 16th of September, 1810. The day is celebrated as Independence Day. Mexico's short recovery after the War of Independence was soon cut short again by the civil wars and institutional instability of the 1850s, which lasted until the government of Porfirio Díaz re-established conditions that paved the way for economic growth. Agustín de Iturbide became constitutional emperor of the First Mexican Empire in 1822. A revolt against him established the United Mexican States. Later, a republican constitution was drafted and Guadalupe Victoria became the first president of the newly born country. During this time, people had difficulty meeting tax payments and resented the central government's actions in collecting customs due to limited trade. The United States annexation of the Republic of Texas and subsequent American military incursion into territory that was part of Coahuila instigated the Mexican-American War. The war was settled in 1848 via the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico was forced to give up more than one-third of its land to the U.S., including Alta California, New Mexico, and the territory claimed by Texas. In the 1860s, Mexico was occupied by France, which established the Second Mexican Empire under the rule of Habsburg Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian of Austria, with support of the Roman Catholic clergy and the conservatives. France never made a profit in Mexico, and its Mexican expedition grew increasingly unpopular. Finally, in the spring of 1865, after the U.S. Civil War was over, the U.S. demanded the withdrawal of French troops from Mexico. Porfirio Díaz was elected the 29th president in the late 19th century. The period, known as the Porfiriato, was characterized by economic stability and growth, significant foreign investment, and influence. The Mexican Revolution began when Madero issued the Plan of San Luis Potosí and declared war on the Díaz regime. By 1911, Díaz is forced to step aside and Madero is elected president. But conflict and violence continue for the better part of the next decade. World War II further stimulated the nation's development through the development of roads, the building of factories, and the establishment of irrigation systems. Until the 80s, Mexico remained a poor country, but experienced substantial economic growth that some historians call the Mexican miracle. In recent years, the Mexican economy has had an unprecedented macroeconomic stability. Its economy is integrated with that of US and also Canada after the North American Free Trade Agreement. Thank you for watching.
When news broke to Catholic priest Miguel Hidalgo that his conspiracy to overthrow the government had been betrayed, he had no choice but to go full rogue and prepare for open rebellion. He didn't know it yet, but that night would change the fate of the continent forever. Hop on the history machine. After 300 years of colonial systems, Latin America was inevitably influenced by changing ideas and balances of power in Europe and in other parts of America. The privileged American-born Spanish descendants were forced to revolt against the European-born elite. The continent was divided into several viceroyalties, each of which went through a process of its own. Mexico's process ended with a conservative victory, while the rest of the provinces were mostly liberal-driven. However, by 1821, one thing was clear. There were new sheriffs in town, and they had all been born on this side of the pond. Simón Bolívar, one of the best remembered liberators, famously argued for one united Spanish-American nation. However, all countries quickly set the borders, rapidly developing national identities distinct from the old world, but most remarkably, from each other. This means Latin America preceded the rise of nation-states in Europe by decades. You could argue that Latin America's history has been painful. Social inequality, racial hierarchies, and injustice abound, with a fair share of dictatorships. But the independence has left us with a deep sense of who we are and the will to determine who we want to be.
As many of you know, if there's any region of the planet I find more demographically fascinating than any other, it's our neighbors to the south. And I hope I've done a good job shattering the Hollywood illusion that all Latin Americans are culturally, religiously, or physically the same. But one aspect of Latino identity that I find neglected is the presence of Black or African blood in the region. This is definitely not a subject well known to the US American or global populace, but needless to say, the Black or Afro-Latino community is of great importance to the social fabric of Latin America, found in nearly every single country south of the US border, yet their presence in American lexicon is virtually non-existent. As we'll discuss later in this video, well over 90% of slaves that crossed the Atlantic ended up in Latin America or the Caribbean, as opposed to the United States, meaning the number of African descendants in this region well outnumbers that in the US, and the community has several interesting quirks, such as having the only surviving monarchy in the Western Hemisphere. From the jungles of the Amazons to the deserts of the Sonora, it is still possible to find pockets of black Latinos in nearly every region of Latin America, yet how on earth did they get there anyways? The history of Africans in the Americas stretches back to the days of Columbus, very shortly after the arrival of the Spaniards in the West Indies, as the Taino and Carib Amerindians rapidly began to die off from Old World diseases, and the Spanish and Portuguese imported slaves from Africa in large numbers to replace their labor, mostly from Central and West Africa, and over time these groups gradually coalesced into a single identity and ethnicity, similar to what occurred in the United States. There are multiple types of African descendants in Latin America today, each with widely varying cultures, appearance, and traditions, the largest and most iconic of which being the Hispanic Afro-Latinos, that being the descendants of former slaves owned by the Criollos, meaning the American-born Spanish elite, who formed their own communities following the abolition of slavery in these countries. They're scattered throughout all areas of the Americas, having no central genetic or cultural unity, although they do all generally speak Spanish as a first language, have Spanish surnames, have varying degrees of European and other non-African admixture, and are generally fairly culturally assimilated into their host countries, with the only main differences between them and their white or mestizo neighbors being their complexion, although they do have certain cultural quirks. This is the same in Brazil, which actually has a larger Afro-descendant population than Hispanic America in terms of numbers and percentages, although the Afro-Brazilian population does not include those of self-described Pardo ancestry, even though Afro-Brazilians very often have large degrees of non-African admixture themselves. Some sources even claim that as high as 1 in 4 Brazilians is of African or mostly African ancestry, which dubious, but we'll touch on that again later. Another much smaller community are those collectively known as the Maroons, a heterogeneous group comprised of runaway slaves who escaped from their Spanish masters hundreds of years ago, forming their own communities deep in the jungles or mountains of whatever country they live in, and may speak Spanish or a Creole language highly influenced by African languages, as because the Maroon communities formed so long ago, the average Maroon has far less non-African admixture and cultural influence than any other group in the Americas, being near full-blooded Africans, and hence have a highly divergent culture from the countries they live in, and may still be isolated to this day. However, in pretty much all other African-descended communities in Latin America, there has been a huge degree of intermixing between other races around them, which has given rise to many different new combinations, such as mulattoes of mixed European and African descent, Zambos of mixed Amerindian and African descent, Douglas of mixed Indian and African descent, as well as combinations of all these other previous groups. Now, this becomes slightly confusing, seeing how in some Latino countries, these various subgroups very often intermix, leaving very little distinction between the various ethnicities, as for instance, in Colombia, little distinction is made by the government and the general populace between Afro-Colombians, Zambos, or mulattoes, with all simply being considered black, while in contrast, the Caribbean country of the Dominican Republic makes a huge distinction between the average Dominican mulatto and the more recently arrived Haitians, who are generally far darker with less non-African admixture. It's common for many in America to simplify the Dominicans' complex history and demographics by branding them all under the label of black. However, the overwhelming majority of Dominicans in the country today reject such a label, refusing to conform to America's racial dichotomy, which only sprung up a couple hundred years ago, compared to the 500-year history of mixing and Spanish heritage in the Dominican Republic. Colombia's African-descended population as a percentage is actually quite comparable to that of the United States, officially sitting around 11% of the population, and you might see this as strange, seeing as how African Colombians have very little representation in Colombian media or American media depicting Colombia, but this is easily explained as the majority of Afro-Colombians are actually concentrated on the country's western coast with the Pacific Ocean, where they make up a strong majority all the way down to the Ecuadorian border and make up less than 2% in the major Colombian cities located in the center of the country. In fact, a band stretching from southern Panama to northern Ecuador is dominated by those of African descent, so think of this region as Hispanic America's Black Belt, similar to the high concentration of blacks in the American South, although over the centuries the Afro-Latino community has spread out to virtually every region of Latin America, especially in Brazil, with the largest percentage being around Bahia in the northeast, although even the white southern states have modest minorities of Afro-Brazilians. The majority of the nations of Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Brazil have at least some degree of African ancestry. Even many self-identified whites or blancos in these areas may have up to 5 to 10% African genes, which is comparable, perhaps a bit higher than many old stock southern whites from states like Louisiana, South Carolina, or Florida, although because of the higher degree of miscegenation in Latin America, these African genes are more spread out. Although around 40 million Latin Americans actively identify as black or of African descent out of Latin America's current population of over 600 million, those with at least some visible African ancestry is triple this amount, or in other words, 1 in every 5 Latinos. The percentage of people in Latin America of African descent was far higher in the past, before the major waves of European migration and interregional flux diluted the African genes into the mixed-race population. However, Afro-Latino communities are still present in virtually every Latin American country, from Mexico to Chile. In the early 19th century, some Central American cities like Tegucigalpa, San Salvador, and Panama City were upwards of 80% Afro-descendant or mulattoes, with this percentage rapidly falling in the next 100 years. This is because, although initially the large cities were mostly full of Criollo slave owners and the mulatto or African ex-slaves, over time mestizos from the countryside gradually migrated to these cities, displacing or assimilating nearly the entire Afro-descendant community, leaving only small traces behind. In fact, it's highly probable that the small Central American country of Belize, once a bastion of Afro-Belizean Creoles, will see their African-descended population be absorbed into the incoming mestizo population that has recently arrived from countries like Guatemala, Mexico, Honduras, and El Salvador. Over time, these African genes have dispersed throughout the population of these different Latino countries, depending heavily on the region or self-identified race, but generally even mestizos from Hispanic America may have between 2 to 10% African DNA, Brazilian Pardos around 15 to 30%, and even some Amerindian groups may have small amounts of admixture through runaway slaves who settled in their communities. But let's take a look at the demographic profile for those who actively identify as black in Latin America and the Caribbean, rather than all of those with any African ancestry. As with other Latin Americans, Afro-Latinos are traditionally Catholic, although increasingly Protestant and evangelical movements have taken a hold in many of these communities, although interestingly a small minority, about 5%, explicitly practice some sort of old traditional animistic African religion such as voodoo, candomblé, or Santeria, in contrast to the United States where these practices have more or less disappeared, and even many self-described Catholics, especially those in the Caribbean, still incorporate elements of these African faiths. Out of the approximately 48 million blacks in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is a slightly higher number than in the US and Canada, they are quite culturally and linguistically diverse because of the many countries they live in, with around a third speaking Portuguese, seeing how Brazil has the largest number, followed by smaller numbers speaking Spanish, such as those in Colombia, Mexico, or Peru, then French, such as that spoken in Haiti, the most African country in the Americas, and then English and various English-based Creoles are of course common throughout the Caribbean, as well as in the Guyanas and Central America, where many Jamaican, Barbadian, or other English-speaking Antillean immigrants migrated to within the past 200 years, and their culture is quite distinct from not only the surrounding Hispanics, but even the Black Latinos, who are far more integrated into their home countries, speaking Spanish, and most, but not all, identify and have loyalties with their own country first, before any specific race or ethnicity. In recent years, many Latinos of full or partial African descent have been trekking north to the United States, particularly to the Northeast, such as Boston, New York, or DC, or to Florida, only a stone's throw away from the Caribbean. And although this is giving slightly more recognition to this highly diverse, numerous group of people, it will probably take time for the American media to recognize that Latinos can be black, white, Asian, or any other race imaginable. Because, as I always say, Latino or Hispanic is not a race, but a cultural identifier. So please let me know your thoughts on the history and culture of African descendants in Latin America, which is truly the most African place in the world outside of sub-Saharan Africa. And for today's poll, tell me which region has the most interesting Black Latino community. And as always, thanks for watching, everyone.
And we're back. What I wanted to do before we moved on to a deeper dive into the Hispanic culture is I wanted to just take a moment, and I brought in Brother Dion to help me have this discussion. Because to see when that whole African slave trade occurred and how through South America, there were some stops there, and then there were some Africans who really took residence in some of the places. Let's just talk a little bit about those facts that you may be aware of.
Yeah, it's really cool because actually about 90% of the Africans actually stopped in Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
So below the U.S., or what we call the U.S. today.
Mm-hmm.
So some went to Mexico, some went to the Caribbean, some went to South America, and others went to Central America.
Yeah.
So as many Africans that we got that came from Africa, that came to the U.S., there was like 3 to 4 times more in Latin America, which is crazy. And some of them actually built their own communities, which another language actually came from, which is a mix of like Creole as well as African.
Wow.
So it would be really difficult for us to understand.
Right.
So
yeah, and I always knew that there was a connection, strong connection with the Hispanic community as well as with the African American community. But it's just interesting to see all the stops that occurred and how we kind of migrated into some of their culture as well as they integrated as we came towards America.
Yeah, and it's really cool because in the Caribbean, the Taino Indians, they were the ones that actually inhabited the like Peru, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, those places. They inhabited those places, and then the Spaniards came along, and they enslaved them, did things like that. They, if you don't mind me saying, they raped them,
Yeah, I don't mind. Let's tell the truth, because a part of that is what we must do.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, a new language came out of that as well. So some words that we actually use today, such as barbecue,
Okay.
like so that came from the Taino Indian language.
Okay.
So they kind of created their own language from Taino Indian and Spanish.
Oh.
And that came together.
Okay.
So you'll see all these different languages that are actually Spanish, but they're different, like kind of different ways of speaking Spanish.
Okay. Okay.
So you have Afro-Latinas or Afro-Latinx speakers, and you have Caribbean Latinx, and then you just have your, I don't want to say normal, but you just have your Spanish speakers.
Right.
So there's a lot of different languages that came out of just that triangular slave trade.
Right.
So
when I look at it, and we're gonna move on to their food, but when we look at it, the Spanish speaking community has been around for a very, very long time.
Yes.
And they have endured a lot of stuff as well.
Right.
But so many communities came in and they've done some things to their culture, but they kind of pretty much kept their heritage pretty strong.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And I mean, like they're only getting stronger as well.
Yeah.
So they're definitely growing as well. Like they're the second largest population within America.
Right.
So, I mean, yeah, they definitely did keep their heritage very strong, and they're still keeping it very strong. And I also wanted to let you know that some of the food, I know we're getting on the food, some of the food actually came from the food that they eat now, such as pasteles, actually came from the scraps that they received when they were slaves as well.
Wow.
So it's crazy how everything just comes full circle.
Yeah.
And, you know, some of the things that we love to eat, the language that we speak comes from like the struggles that we went through.
Right. And that's why I felt it was so important that we share the Hispanic heritage, because we to know our history, to know the connections, to know the strength of this community is very important to me. Let's just take a moment and let's look at some of the foods that they eat, and we'll see exactly what you were talking about.
We are getting spicy and authentic out here in the Publix kitchen. We have Chef Christian Guzman, who is here to tell us about some Latin favorites and traditions that you just have to have on the Christmas holiday. Thank you for coming in.
You're welcome.
Oh, so where are we starting? This smells so good, by the way.
So these are only a few things. Obviously, we can't get into everything.
Everything.
We'll be here all day. But these are mostly some of the favorites. What I have here is arroz con gandules. This is banana leaves. It really gives it that smoky, smoky flavor to it.
Oh, it smells so good.
And it's really, really nice. What's in here is pigeon peas. No actual pigeons, just a type of peas.
It's called pigeon peas.
Right. A lot of people, freak out about
Pigeon
that. Right. There's salted pork fatback in there. That really gives it that. There's a lot of pork flavor in there.
Yes.
Medium grain rice. You can use anything from ham, pork chops.
Oh, it looks so good.
Butts.
We've got the finished one over here. I'm going to steal a bite of this because it looks so delicious.
Go for it.
And lots of flavor and seasoning.
Right.
That's really good. Now, this is just something that goes along with your traditional meal.
Right. This is the most have. Yeah. You know it goes with. This is one of the main starches in there. You have the potato salad as well. You have the pernil, which is the pork. With the crispy skin. Pasteles usually it's a big during the holidays as well.
It's really yummy. Okay. What's
now
next?
Here, this is called pasteles, and there's different types. There's some mostly a vegetable root dough, masa. There's yuca, you can do it on it. This particular one has bananas, green bananas, plantains, a little bit of the pumpkin, just to give it that nice little sweet flavor.
Yeah, that's going to be a great flavor.
And then malanga, which is the type of little slimy, another really starchy, just to bind it all together. Boil it for about 20-30 minutes, and then from there you can just
Take it out, open it, and this is our final.
Right.
This is what it looks like.
It's stuffed with pork as well.
Okay.
We're really big on pork in Puerto Rico.
On pork and pork. Well, you know what? That's okay. This looks delicious as well, and I'm excited to try. This is the first time I've tried this.
Really. Garbanzo beans, and it's wrapped in the banana leaves as well.
Oh my gosh, it's so good.
Gives it
and
a
you're
nice
right,
flavor.
it's like a sweet,
right,
little bit of a sweet flavor.
Right. Got a nice sweet flavor to it.
Okay, so we also you also have a very popular and festive drink to show us.
Right. This is it's called coquito, which translates to little coconut.
Little coconut.
Now this is our traditional eggnog. There's no egg in it, but it's compared to it.
Okay.
Now I'll be making today
let me get you over here.
What I'll be making today, obviously, you can put a lot of rum in it.
Okay.
For the adults.
Well, we've been talking about that all morning.
Yeah. For the kids, you don't have to.
Okay.
Now I'll be making it right. So there's a can of, closely on the recipe, there's a can of cream of coconut, there's a can of condensed milk, and a can of evaporated milk.
Okay. So what are we starting with? That's the
cream of coconut.
Cream of coconut.
We'll just add it all in there.
Is this condensed?
Correct.
And
that's the evaporated milk.
Oh, that's the evaporated.
Yep. The condensed.
Okay.
And now you want to get all of this in there.
Oh, you got to get all that.
This is the yummy stuff. It's right.
Is this our rum?
That is our vanilla.
Oh, that's vanilla. Oh, yeah, that is vanilla.
I'm making it kid friendly today.
Yes. Okay, that's good. Should I put the vanilla in?
Please.
Does everything go in? Okay, we got a little bit of vanilla.
And now
almonds.
This is optional. You can add a little bit of almonds, not too much, just to give it a nice little kick. There's going to be a little bit of cinnamon.
Oh, that looks good.
Yep. And now we just
give it a go.
Yes.
All right, here we go. It's going to get loud for a second, folks, but we got to have that to get to the end result.
Correct.
Obviously, with the nuts in there, you want to give it a little bit more of a go.
Give it an actual little bit of go. And as long as you put it in the fridge, usually like overnight or something, gives it a nice consistency to it.
This is our final.
Correct. That is, of course.
Oh, it smells delicious.
It does. That's the special treat.
How did I know that one had rum?
That is the special treat.
All right, Chef Christian, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
To everybody watching at home, I'm going to make one of these for you. We're going to toast when we get to the break, and we will be right back after this. Cheers.
And we're back. As I shared with you at the onset of our show today, that it is very important to me as a pastor, to E Zion Fair as a church, that we celebrate the heritage of people of color. Our Latino community have been very, very close to the African American community. You had an opportunity to see that today. And I believe that they have such a rich and strong heritage that is often not told. We spend a lot of time here in America highlighting European history and European culture, but please always know that when we start talking about Puerto Rico and places like that, that is in America. And all too often, we try to forfeit the understanding of that. Today, we were able to see the differences between the two communities within the Spanish-speaking community, the Latinx, as well as the Hispanic communities. We also were able to see in their history how the African Americans are tied and was a part of their culture at certain times. And then we got to the foods. And in the foods, we have opportunity to see some of the items that they certainly use quite often, whether it be the pea. I can't remember exactly the phraseology of it, but the reality of it is we get a chance to see the culture. But this is the thing I want to leave you with as we are coming to the end of this time that we are sharing together, is that our Latino community is a very resilient and strong community, have been through a lot of stress and struggle, but have survived. And they have survived to a level unimaginable. We often talk about in our African American community how resilient we are as a people, but we can never ever discount the struggles of our Latino community. And my whole goal was to ensure that we highlight and share. Last week, we brought in one of our sisters who came in, and she's a part of the Latino community, and she shared several things with us, but I wanted from a historical perspective to share with you all, exactly, some of the facts of their community, of their heritage, of who they are and what they have been through. It becomes important that we know our brothers and our sisters. The Bible says to know them who labor among you. The struggles that you see that's happening in America is not by accident. Their heritage is not highlighted to the level that, as I said a few minutes ago, as the European heritage. I'm not trying to be decisive and to create problems, but we have to recognize that a people who are as resilient as our Latino brothers and sisters, they have a story to tell. They have a history to be known. And shame on those individuals who don't believe that their history should be a part of the American history. Because at the end of the day, the American history is rooted and grounded in the Latino community. So we want to take this opportunity to thank all of you who watched us today. And we want to say congratulations and celebration to our Latino community. And thank you for the contributions that you all constantly share with our community. Thank you for your struggle, because your struggles have made your success and have made you greater. I hope and trust that the little we shared today will cause you to have someone else to go and do more research on the heritage of our Hispanic community. What a great people. This is Pastor Curry saying, until the next time, may the Lord God bless you real good.